some reason it's not the best one. But anyway, I hope you're feeling good. So thank you, Carmen, for organizing this. I think that it comes in the right moment. We know that we're living in a world of pandemic. We know that that has impacts in the most vulnerable groups around the world. But still, the world is moving, and we have to know how to deal with what's happening at the international level. And one of the important events of this year is UNEA 5.2, which is the main, which is the center of our discussion today. We have a great number of, we have a great panelists today that will share some information in relation to, Carmen will give an introduction of the Junea Unep. Then we will have Simon Levera, who will provide some information related to nature-based solutions. Jane Patton, who will talk about marine and plastics. We will also talk about Stockholm plus 50. And Dalia Marquez then will share some information in relation to environmental governance. And Ingrid Rostad will help us understand about UNEA and next steps. At the end, we will have some question and answers, a section to respond some answers and perhaps exchange some further information or questions there might be. So without further delay, I just say hello. I reiterate my greetings to you all, those who are just connecting. I will ask all panelists to introduce themselves when you start your presentation, please. So without any further delay, let me welcome Carmen, please, who will give us an introduction to Unep. Please, Carmen, go ahead. You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And I'm going to start the presentation. We are a little bit short on time, but we want to make this really very introductory so people can start engaging with this process, which is UNEA, the United Nations Environmental Assembly, especially for those who are not familiarized with this process. Well, UNEA comes from, it's part of Unep. Unep is the United Nations Environmental Program, which was funded 50 years ago. It started 50 years ago, and the mission of UNEP is to confront the biggest environmental challenges that we face, not only as countries, but as a global society. So after after Rio plus 20, we have seen that the challenges are really big and that we need a bigger action in terms of the environmental challenges that we face. So the UNEA, it's at the heart of what we know as Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. And the idea of the Environmental Assembly is to start dealing with these environmental problems that we see that they are growing every day more, and that we have to kind of like start dealing with them. So the Environmental Assembly has the aim to gather representatives and environmental ministers of all the countries that are part of United Nations, around 192, that in order to start working on many of these environmental issues that that are right now challenging our ways of life, and especially our ecosystems, our biodiversity, our climate, and things that are more simple, like our rivers, like our mountains, and so on. So after Rio plus 20, we have this assembly that has the aim to deal with these problems. And the great challenge that we have is that, and what is important about this year is that UNEP, it's 50 years of UNEP, and also of the Stockholm Convention. The Stockholm Convention is the first time we're talking about environmental problems at a global level. So it's been 50 years of trying to deal with environmental problems. So we think it's important that we start facing these problems and to start giving a solution, but a global solution. Environment doesn't recognize political boundaries, so many of the environmental challenges that we face, they cannot be dealt at a national level, but at an international level. So the United Nations has an Assembly Bureau and the Committee of Permanent Representatives, which are the representatives that the countries have in Nairobi, that they are negotiating constantly the resolutions and the decisions that are going to put in agenda, so everybody can agree on those and come as resolutions, and then those should be transformed at a national level in policies. So UNEP, right now we are in the 5th United Nations Assembly. The first part was held last year in February of 2021. Due to the pandemic, it was held online. So right now there's going to be a second part, which is from February to March 2nd. That's why we have UNEA 5.1 and we have UNEA 5.2, because it's the same process, but it has been divided into to make it hybrid and to have more participation, and especially because we have to recognize that we're having a great challenge right now because of COVID. So from the first session, we have a document, which is a strengthening action for nature to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, because as we mentioned, it's in the core of the development of the Sustainable Development Agenda. And as we mentioned, it's the 50th anniversary of the creation of Unep. And this document, what has in core is the issues of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. So later I will send all this, I will share on the chat this PowerPoint, so you can enter and download whatever you think is interesting or that you want. So right now we are at the doors of UNEA 5.2, which is going to be a hybrid meeting, still not fully in person. We're going to have a participation in person, but also online. So that's important to point out, because since it's online, it also makes it easy to follow the negotiations by UN TV, but it's harder to advocate, to do actions, or to influence directly in some of the resolutions. But that is why it's so important that we engage as civil society, as networks, and we start monitoring what it's happening in UNEA, because as I mentioned, this has to be transformed in national policies. So one important document that we have to take into account is the Ministerial Declaration that came on October of last year. And it's based on strengthening action for nature to achieve Sustainable Development Goals. And it is like the preamble of everything that's going to come during UNEA 5.1. Some of the important dates, we're going to have a global major groups and stakeholders forum from February 7th to the 10th. I'm going to send you the link. The idea is of the Global Major Groups and Stakeholders Forum is to have the position of civil society. We'll talk about it later. There is a meeting about the implementation of Resolution 73333, which is a resolution on global on environmental governance. There's going to be an open-end CPR. We talked about the Committee of the Permanent Representatives. This is kind of like the last meeting to present everything that's been drafting, like in almost a clean clean document, which will be presented and discussed in UNEA 5.2. And then we have a special session that's going to be the anniversary of Unep plus 50 on March 3 to 4. All this, you can follow it online. And I encourage you to also participate.
Sorry to interrupt you, Carmen, but you have just 1 more minute left.
Yes, and one more minute is all I need. There are 5 clusters and a number of resolutions that I will pass through really fast. There's a cluster on marine and plastic pollution. We have Jane that's going to be talking a little bit about it. We have two draft resolutions, one from Rwanda, Peru, the other one from Japan. The other is the cluster of nature-based solutions and biodiversity. Simone is going to be talking a little bit more about that. There is a resolution on sustainable lake management that comes from Indonesia, a resolution on nature-based solutions that many of civil society are kind of like discussing and debating about it. And there is a resolution about the welfare of animals. So it's very interesting because we were starting to talk about welfare of the environment, of animals, and of biodiversity as a key issue to achieve sustainability. Then we have the cluster on chemicals and minerals. There's a number of resolutions like the one on nitrogen, the sound management of chemicals and waste. There is, they want to make a panel on chemical and waste, a resolution on a science policy panel on chemical waste and pollution. It may be like the Q equivalent of the IPCC for climate change or the IPBES for biodiversity, but this should be for chemicals and pollutions. The resolution about mineral resources, which is very linked to minery and how minery is being done right now. The other resolution, the other clusters is green recovery and circular economy. Eritrea, on behalf of the African group, has some resolutions on green economy and circular economy, which are going to be 2 issues that are going to be very discussed right now. And finally, we have a cluster 5, which is the organizational and administrative matters. This is more the bureaucratic stuff that goes on within UNEA, but it's going to come out the next, the resolution for where next UNEA is going to be and how it's going to be. So the invitation to the Global Major Group and Stakeholders Forum, and thank you very much. Thank you, Gadir. And thank you, everybody. You can type some questions in the chat, and later in the question and answers, we are going to be talking about those. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carmen, for that introduction. Very useful for us to understand the context of the meeting, what they're going to be about. Like she said, we will have a question and answer section at the end, but you can use the chat in the Zoom platform to interact, to share some information, to ask some questions. You know, there's a good number of people connected, and of course your experience, the experience of every one of you is very valid. So let's move on with the presentations. Now let me introduce you to to a colleague and a friend, Simone Lovera. Welcome, Simone. I hope you're doing fine. It's been quite a while that we don't see each other. Please introduce yourself briefly for those who don't know you yet, and go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Gadir. It's good to see you. At least looking good. I hope you're feeling as well, good as well. I'll try to share my screen. That is not going well. But 1 moment, please. For some reason, it doesn't show my screen. Sorry, for some reason I'm not getting. I don't think.
Yes, now we can see your screen.
But my desktop, I think. I can't even see what I see here. Wait, oops. Can you see my screen now, the PowerPoint?
Yes, now we can see your screen.
Okay, this is okay? Yes.
Yeah, it's okay.
So sorry for those hassles. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit about nature-based solutions, which is quite a very popular concept these days that you see appearing all over the world. But they've also raised quite some controversy, and I'll try to explain why they are so controversial and why people really feel that their nature should not be the solution of others. First, to introduce myself, so I work for the Global Forest Coalition, which is a global coalition of, at the moment, 119 indigenous peoples organizations, women's groups, and NGOs from 71 different countries. And our main mission is to strive for rights-based forest conservation and restoration policies. So to really prioritize the rights and needs, and also the role of indigenous peoples, local communities, and women. So nature-based solutions sound very nice, but they're actually kind of wolf in sheep's clothing. First of all, it's important to realize that the expression, which at this moment is not formally defined, but the expression is really that they are solutions using nature. Solutions for human beings, but especially also for business and industry. And the origin of nature-based solutions was really in IUCN, the World Conservation Union, which started to use the concept about a little less than 10 years ago. Then there was a lot of emphasis within the World Conservation Union on collaboration with business and industries. And when corporations also for the first time became members of IUCN, I mean, they've had congresses at that moment in which they literally had buttons, wearing buttons that nature was their business. So they were very business oriented, and obviously they felt that biodiversity conservation was a kind of terminology, or ecosystem approaches, which we feel is a much stronger expression, was too complicated language for business and industry, and that nature-based solutions was something that could be very well marketed towards business and industry. So they really kicked off with that. They now have all kinds of resolutions, and part of this agenda has been taken over, especially by the EU, but also countries like Costa Rica, etc., which have very strong IUCN offices. And I must say there have been attempts by IUCN themselves to define them. There is a formal definition developed, also with criteria, and those criteria try to, really make them as biodiversity friendly as possible. And what's very important for this Unea session is that the EU has now proposed a resolution in which they also will include an elaborate definition, assuming that will then avoid some of the bad projects. However, the big problem with these definitions is that they do not exclude carbon offsets or biodiversity offsets. And this is most likely to become by far the biggest market for nature-based solutions, will be especially carbon offsets, especially forest carbon offsets. Now, defined or not, nature-based solutions can include the good, the bad, and the evil. And what you typically see in international fora is that they're actively being promoted with the good examples. And there are good examples. For example, ecosystem-based approaches to adaptation are now being sold as nature-based solutions. So you conserve a mangrove, and that works for, coastal defense. So that is wonderful. But the problem is that those kinds of projects are not very profitable, because very few governments invest seriously into adaptation, to resilience. So, having that kind of mangrove conservation is not a very profitable project. By far, the most profitable projects are actually monoculture tree plantations, because you can plant trees in a very easy, cheap manner, just long rows. If you just kill with a lot of herbicides all the undergrowth, most monoculture tree plantations are subject to very active herbicide use. Then you can make sure that those trees, especially if they are alien invasive trees like eucalypt, they grow very fast. You can sell the wood later on, and in the meantime, you can sell all of this as a forest carbon offset. So Actually, forest-related projects are by far the biggest chunk of nature-based solution at the moment. And we also realize that these kind of nature-based solution, net zero approaches are sort of the new language that is used for what used to be called REDD+, reduction of emissions from deforestation and forest degradation and 100 forest carbon stocks. That's a policy that was adopted more than 10 years ago, 15 years ago, by the Climate Convention. And I must say, a lot of people have been very disappointed about that policy, including, for example, CIFOR, which is a Center for International Forestry Research, the UN research organization, in the field of forestry, which in a elaborate research has concluded that REDD+ is very often gender blind, participation of rights holders has been limited, and in general, it has failed to deliver results on the ground. And I think it's important to look at this experience with REDD+ to see what can go wrong and is already going wrong with nature-based solutions. For example, one of these things, it's very much focused towards area-based conservation. So you conserve one area, be it a forest, but it can also be other ecosystems now. However, if you just do that and you don't address the driver, which is in the overwhelming amount of cases commodity production and consumption, like, for example, beef, meat consumption, like soy consumption, palm oil, that production will just shift to another area. You call that indirect land use change and leakage. So, you will just promote deforestation or biodiversity destruction in an area. This whole area-based system, to make a long story short, in the interest of time, is extremely complicated. You need monitoring, reporting, verification, and that is all very costly. It's done by very expensive consultancy firms. The experience with REDD+ is that about 70% of all the funds invested in these kinds of nature-based solutions are just wasted on just the bureaucracy around it. Lands are being bought or grabbed by powerful actors. Of course, when you make a very profitable market in these nature-based solutions, people and companies with a lot of money will step into it. There's a lot of a very huge trends these days towards what they call philanthropic capitalism. Very big, very powerful CEOs like Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, investing massive amounts of money, 1 billion in the case of Jeff Bezos, and thus getting a lot of control over people's ecosystems. They will be incentivized to buy a lot of land or to otherwise purchase it, make sure it's under their control, and that will, of course, lead to a lot of land concentration as well. Because they often, in carbon offset and biodiversity offset, you need to guarantee that what you do is permanent. And that was actually a huge challenge on the REDD+. This will incentivize forest conservation because, the corporations that invest in these areas will really be incentivized to make sure that nobody, comes in and maybe cuts 1 or 2 trees for firewood or something like that. So it's really a strong incentive to make sure, people are being kept out of these areas. And one very fundamental problem is also that, there's an issue that's called baseline. That is, okay, you present that you do an action, you do a conservation project. And that is based on the assumption that if you don't do that, in no action, that area would be destroyed. But that's actually a very cynical scenario. Because let's be serious, this planet has perfectly conserved itself before humans started to destroy it. The no action scenario in a normal forest is conservation. The forest will perfectly be able to conserve itself. And it's very devastating that nowadays the assumption is being created that business as usual is destruction. And if you don't want destruction, we need to pay for it. I think that's a very, very, cynical assumption that we cannot afford these days. Also not in terms of restoration. Many lands are nowadays being qualified as degraded. And then they say, oh, there's no problem to put monoculture tree plantations on such land, because they're already degraded, so we can do anything with them, or bioenergy plantations, for example. However, this area is actually very close to the area I just saw, the monoculture tree plantation in Espírito Santo in Brazil, which is one of the states with the highest level of plantations on earth. 60% of the entire state is covered by monoculture tree plantation. This is former cattle land. Now, this looks degraded, but this is in the Mata Atlântica zone, and experience has shown that 80% of the Mata Atlântica zone is able to naturally regenerate in a set-aside scenario. That is, if you just leave this land alone, there's a very big chance that in 50 years, this will be forest again, a natural ecosystem. Secondary, but it will grow back. However, if you now plant eucalypt in this land, it will be lost forever. There's nothing as devastating for lands as eucalypt. But you can also see that, what you really need to do in these scenarios is to take away the drivers. And that's what nature-based solutions don't do. A very good example, actually, of this is the Costa Rican model. Here, the biggest drivers is meat consumption, just like in Paraguay. In Paraguay also, you just see that as long as you would be able to reduce the demand for meat, a lot of areas still have the capacity to restore. And in Costa Rica, that has happened because the main success story in Costa Rica is that their forests grew back after the beef market in Costa Rica completely collapsed in the early 90s. It's often said that Costa Rica restored its forest because of payment for environmental services. This is not true. This is incorrect. The payment for environmental service law came into place already 4 years after Costa Rican's forest began to grow back. And it has hardly added something according to very convincing research that has been done to its effectiveness. There's another big problem with nature-based solutions, and that's because it's so much oriented towards business and industry, because it's a concept that was developed for business and industry. It will really hand over biodiversity governance to big corporations. Here you see a couple of examples: Shell, Total, British Petrol, not exactly the most nature-friendly companies in the world, I would say. How they are investing nowadays in nature-based solutions as they see the forest carbon offset market as the biggest booming market in the world at the moment. Also thanks to the big failure of the Glasgow conference, which just gave a go-ahead for this kind of completely fake projects. And I say fake because we've just seen with the REDD+ experience, that a lot of these projects do not really help forests in the end, but you're talking about amounts of 100 million a year, being invested by these companies into these nature-based solutions, into, buying up lands that they will then subsequently govern. The aviation sector should be specifically marketed. They're completely gearing up to having massive forest carbon offsets for the emissions, and that will also create a lot of wet air. And with all that, it should be kept in mind that just investing in nature-based solutions is not the solution for biodiversity conservation. Because actually, no matter how much money you invest in biodiversity conservation, it is completely bleached out by the amount of money that is currently invested into biodiversity destruction. Between $4 and $6 trillion is being invested in terms of private and public investment into activities that are destroying biodiversity, of which $260 billion of subsidies. Governments pretending to conserve biodiversity, but actually subsidizing their destruction. Of course, the first thing that should be done in a convention on biodiversity, global biodiversity framework, is to make sure there's a very strong targets to rule out this money. You don't need to invest in a forest because the forest doesn't grow on money. It just grows on land. You just need to make sure that it has that land and that's not being destroyed. That is the business as usual scenario. But you should make sure that there's no money going into activities that destroy that forest. However, the big problem, and we did a big report on it that's available on our website, last year in 2020 actually already, is that because there's more and more corporate capture of biodiversity conservation policy, including through IUCN, but also through Unep, that creates an incentive to not address, these destructive subsidies and investments, because of course companies profit from these subsidies and profit from these investments. So you get this kind of circular economy of, governments becoming more and more dependent on corporate funding, and subsequently giving more and more subsidies to these corporations, because how better that those corporations thrive, the more funding they can get from those corporations. And sadly, you very much see that in United Nations Environment Programme as well, where you see corporations becoming more and more influential, all kinds of public-private partnerships of UNEP, with big corporations, with big, including very destructive producers, and as a result, the policy is being influenced to make sure that, for example, investments and subsidies into devastating sectors like the meat sectors are not being addressed. And a very specific example here is actually here in Paraguay, because the Unep together through the GEF has a very big collaboration with the soy sector here for what they call zero deforestation soy. And then 2 years ago, Unep actually published a report on the big impacts of meat consumption. And immediately the reaction here of the soy producers was, if you ever mention meat consumption again, we will step out of the partnership. And I haven't seen new Unep reports about the impact of meat consumption again after that. And I must say, it's not an issue that's very at the forefront on its agenda on sustainable food systems of this United Nations Environment Assembly. So obviously the soy producers have had some influence probably there. But of course, these things are all very subtle. I mean, this will never be admitted.
Sorry to interrupt you. Oh yeah, you're about.
Last slide. So the solution is actually simple, because indigenous peoples, local communities, and especially women amongst them, have proven that they're perfectly capable of living in harmony with nature, of having a sustainable livelihood, and at the meantime conserving and restoring forests and other ecosystems. So what we should really strive for is to recognize the rights and needs of women, of indigenous peoples, of local communities, and make sure that they get governance over the lands where the biodiversity is growing. There's a particular emphasis on the role, rights, and needs and aspirations of women and girls in biodiversity conservation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simone, for bringing into the debate so clearly, the data you have collected, well, the Global Forest Coalition has collected, and how clearly it reflects how the world is moving, the direction we're taking. Thank you very much for that. And again, I reiterate that, what Simone presented also gives food for a lot of thought and conversation. So don't be shy to use the chat and ask any questions you need to Simone in the chat too. Let me give the space now to Jane Patton, please. Go ahead, Jane. And don't forget to introduce yourself for those who don't know you.
I will definitely not forget. Thank you so much. I'm gonna share my screen quickly. Can you confirm you can see the slide, Kadir?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jane Patton. I am the campaigns manager for plastics and petrochemicals with the Center for International Environmental Law, or CL, as some of you might know it. CL is based in DC and Geneva, Switzerland, but I have the distinct pleasure of being based in Louisiana in the south of the US, where I am from. Because of where I live in the world, and specifically the United States, I think about the issue of plastic pollution from a particular lens. We make a lot of the world's plastics down in the south of the US, and there are a few other places around the world where plastic production is concentrated. Which means I don't think of the plastic pollution crisis as a marine crisis. I don't think of it as a single issue crisis. I think of it as multifaceted, a crisis that affects the human health, the climate, human rights, and that has impacts throughout the plastic life cycle. So the global policy agenda has for a long time discussed the issue of plastic pollution as a marine plastic litter issue. But increasingly recently over the last few years, that understanding of the issue of plastics has grown, not only because data on the toxic impacts, the toxic production and use of plastics has grown, but also because it's become clear that more than 90% of plastics that are produced are actually not disposed of responsibly. They're not recycled. They end up landfilled or, unfortunately, incinerated or burned. And this entire process actually produces a significant amount of greenhouse gases, making plastics also a huge part of the climate crisis, and meaning that addressing the climate crisis and addressing the plastics crisis are in many cases actually addressing one and the same crisis, especially to think about Simone's presentation and the link with the profiteering from big business. The plastics industry, the chemicals industry, the oil and gas industry, y'all, these are the same industries, and they all have the same influence over both domestic and global policy worldwide. So let's talk for a second about plastics on the agenda at UNEA specifically. So as Carmen went over, the UN Environment Assembly has been meeting in this form since 2014. Plastics have been on the agenda since the very first UNEA meeting. And they've been on the global agenda of concern since the 1970s and 1980s. We are now, however, at a very crucial moment. We have significant momentum and support from more than 140 countries for a comprehensive global response to this global problem. We are talking about creating a new treaty, a new global agreement to address the plastics crisis. This UNEA 5.2 meeting, as Carmen said, there is the Committee of Permanent Representatives meeting in that week of February 21st, and then the formal UNEA meeting in the week of February 28th. Those two meetings are going to be very significant for progress on the global plastics policy agenda, because that is the meeting where we will decide the terms of negotiation of this treaty. Once we get through UNEA 5.2, we will begin actually negotiating the treaty. So what is on the table at UNEA is proposals for what form that treaty could take. And more specifically, it's actually proposals for what form negotiation of that treaty could take. There are right now 2 draft resolutions on the table, and one of them is actually outlining a mandate and a process for negotiation that is going to be much more successful and comprehensive than the other. What it's very clear we need from an intergovernmental negotiating committee is we need a treaty that will be legally binding, and not just a binding treaty, but legally mandated targets for reduction and prevention. We need a treaty that will address the full life cycle of plastics, from production through use, through application, through disposal. And we need a mandate that will allow for robust discussion of all of the specific obligations and provisions that will make such a treaty specific. If it's not addressed in the mandate, it likely won't be negotiated as part of the treaty, which means we need to find that sweet spot of exactly the right detail to include in the mandate to allow for an open and robust discussion, but to not prejudge what goes into the treaty. As of right now, there's a resolution on the table from Rwanda and Peru that has, at least at this point, 53 countries that are co-sponsoring and endorsing that resolution. That resolution really gets at what we need out of a negotiating committee to be able to build the treaty and the outcome that we need to prevent harm from plastic pollution. There is another draft resolution on the table, sponsored by Japan, and right now I think endorsed by only 3 other countries, that has much less detail, that has a closed mandate that would focus only on marine litter. And considering the climate, human health, and human rights impacts of the entire plastic supply chain, we have got to get out of this space of thinking of plastics only as a marine litter issue. So what we are asking for countries, from countries going into and coming out of UNEA 5.2, is to endorse the Rwanda-Peru resolution and to push for an ambitious treaty, an ambitious negotiation process that actually takes into account all of the detail that we will need to cover in order to have a successful outcome. So here's how you can get involved. As of right now, we have a call to action that is so far endorsed by more than 900 stakeholders in more than 125 countries. I don't know if you can tell, but I get very excited talking about how much momentum we've been able to build among civil society, indigenous peoples, workers and trade unions, women and other major groups to actually bring forward a united voice into UNEA 5.2 to say, this is our vision for what we want, and we are going to work together and coordinate and support countries to get there. Coming out of that call to action, we have created a plastics treaty task force, which several folks on this call have been participating in. And that is a very diverse and very wide-ranging group of folks who are coming together across many angles of looking at the plastics problem to really understand what is the gravity of what we are facing and how do we actually advocate for the solution that will get us there. If you would like to join that task force, my colleague Rachel is actually on the line with us today, and her email is in the slide, and she'll also put it in the chat, and she's going to be your point of contact for joining that task force, which is really exciting. And we are going to be meeting monthly throughout the next calendar year, both to prepare for UNEA itself and also to actually organize our advocacy around the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee. So you don't have to weigh in on this process alone. There is a whole group of experts and coordinating people from across the world who are coming together to actually get this done together and in the right way that will actually solve the problem and address human rights. And with that, I'm going to hand it now back to our host, and thank you again for having me as part of this conversation. I unfortunately have to drop off early for another meeting, but Rachel is going to stay here with you, and she can answer any of your questions, and anything she can't can be directed back to me. But in closing, I'll just say quickly, this treaty task force is going to be weighing into UNEA 5.2 and coordinating throughout the meetings. Right now, we're estimating we're going to have 25 to 30 people on the ground at UNEA, some of whom are covering multiple clusters. And then we'll probably have another 40 or 50 people that are joining online, and we'll all be coordinating together. So if you want to be part of this force, I don't know about y'all, but I got to do this work with other people. I can't do it by myself because I get lost in it. And so if you want to be part of this organizing space, please make sure that Rachel has your contact information. And thank you again for inviting me and us to be part of this today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane, for that presentation. Very useful information. It's also great to know that the task force is open, that you're willing to work with others, because we definitely need more than ever, perhaps solidarity and cohesion among civil society. You know, this UNEA, but all UN international spaces are very privileged spaces already as they are. With the COVID pandemic, we know that especially our folks, well, we in the global south and the most vulnerable groups have a lot more limitations. So all the efforts of working together for these important issues in different forests is very important. Thank you, Jane, and thank you, Rachel. The contact information is there, and you can, I reiterate, you can post your questions there or exchange some further information. Now let me welcome Teresa Oberhaus from the Children and Youth Major Group. Teresa, are you there? Are you ready with your presentation?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead, Teresa.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Allow me to share my screen. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. My name is Teresa Oberhauser. I'm one of the 2 global focal points of the Children and Youth Major Group, and very delighted to be here and tell you a bit about the arrangements around Stockholm 50 and Unep 50. As you may know, in the civil society engagement towards United Nations Environmental Program, we are cooperating very closely among the 9 major groups that are engaging in as civil society, business leaders, community leaders, and so on and so forth, towards the negotiation processes of UNEP. And we work very closely together on some of the upcoming main projects. So for example, we currently have thematic clusters among the major groups. So always 2, 3, 4 colleagues work together in preparing basically a specific project or conference and so on, and to make sure that the stakeholder engagement towards those projects is going very well. And I'm very happy to basically talk a bit about 2 of the most important projects, I would say, of 2022, but it might be personal. And that is Stockholm 50 and Unep 50, for which the Children and Youth Major Group has the great situation that we are in the clusters that are leading that. So if we look at Stockholm plus 50, what is Stockholm plus 50? Stockholm plus 50 obviously is one of the plus 50 conferences that we know a lot of plus 50 and plus 20 conferences, which means it's an anniversary conference of the first ever organized environmental conference from 1972. This anniversary conference will take place on 2nd and 3rd of June 2022. It is not specifically a part of the negotiation agenda of Unep, so that's why you don't see it basically prominently reflected in the negotiations towards UNEA. But Unep has, as per the UN General Assembly resolution, has the role of host agency basically for Stockholm plus 50, and is therefore the responsible UN entity towards Stockholm plus 50. And but of course there are other UN entities involved in the process. It is a high-level meeting, an international meeting as it's called, that will be hosted in Stockholm in June. And it will evolve around the triple planetary crisis: climate, nature, and pollution, with the Swedish government as the host country, together with Kenya, who have expressed a very big focus on sustainable consumption and production topics itself. Now, if we look at it, the most interesting thing, of course, for us is what are the outcomes? Why are we working on this? And how does it fit with other developments? I mean, most of you as engaged civil society stakeholders in the UNEP know that the most important thing in the UN system is always making sure we can link political outcomes to negotiation process and make sure that there is progress, that there is a UN entity, that there is a negotiation process like UNEA and the Committee of Permanent Representatives that can keep following up on specific topics and make sure that these resolutions are basically are being taken forward. And there's also a monitoring and evaluation process related to that. Stockholm plus 50 is not directly connected to that. It is an international meeting that will revolve around 3 leadership dialogues. And the most important outcomes, as you can see here, are intergovernmental in nature, and basically linked to previous big milestones. For example, it is also linked to the future we want. When we look at what UNEP is focusing on when it comes to Stockholm plus 50, the 2 outcomes that they have indicated in the presented in the annual subcommittee is the recommendations that contribute to the environmental dimension of sustainable development to accelerate the implementation of commitments in the context of decade of action and delivery of sustainable development, including a sustainable recovery. And secondly, of course, the summary of the discussion as presented by the co-chairs. So those are the 2 main outcome documents, and the most important developments there will be around the 3 leadership dialogues, and also the preparatory processes towards that, where we are already among the major groups looking at how we can make sure we can get engaged in the preparation of those leadership dialogues early on to actually shape that work. If we look at the actors engaged, UN environmental programs, of course, the host, and with Swedish and Kenyan government as the 2 host countries. Of course, a bit of a extra focus on Sweden because of the location, but Kenya is just as much an official host country. Which is also why it will be very interesting now at UNEA to really see how UNEA is like a stepstone towards the Stockholm plus 50 conference in some sense. Of course, UNEA is a lot more than just a stepstone to Stockholm plus 50. Yeah, around that, of course, there are other stakeholders involved. For example, EMG is a big question mark. If there's basically some engagements around broader engagement on environment between UN entities, then the Green Growth Knowledge Platform that UNEP has basically been working with and has been setting up, and UNDP is organizing some consultations around Stockholm plus 50 at that moment as well. I think the most important thing, this is obviously not new to you, but I think the most important thing is as Stockholm plus 50 is going beyond the UNEA negotiation agenda, it is quite crucial for us to see how can we make sure that as stakeholders engaged in UNEP, we can actively engage in the processes towards that, and making sure that that apart from all the other activities that the hosts are looking into, that major groups are really prominently presented when it comes to giving input to Stockholm plus 50 and making sure there's also a follow-up, ideally linked to UNEA processes in some shape or form. From our side, I also still wanted to indicate, now I'm shifted a streams. Yeah, from our side also, on a personal note, from the Children and Youth Major Group, we have started working on Stockholm Plus 50 about 2 years ago, and we have set up a youth task force on Stockholm Plus 50. So for which we are always cooperating with other major groups as well, and are looking forward to a lot of activities towards Stockholm Plus 50. So feel free to reach out if you want to know more about representatives from your organizations or clusters in the youth task force. Unep at 50 is very linked to Stockholm Plus 50. It is the anniversary conference of the creation of Unep. Stockholm Plus 50 was kind of a stepstone to the creation of Unep at 50, but at the same time, it is a very separate celebration, which is actually just informally called Unep at 50. Practically speaking, it's called UNEA Special Session, which will be held the 2 days after UNEA. There has also been quite some preparation for that already. In October 2020, the Major Group Facilitation Committee started working on the preparations towards UNEP at 50 stakeholder engagement with a cluster from the Science and Technology and Children and Youth Major Group that was targeting that, and in order to implement the ideas around stakeholder engagement for Stockholm Plus 50 for UNEP at 50 that have been set out. If we look at the exact details of that, there are a lot of key activities around a main report, which is called the UNEP We Want. And that started with a survey among major group and stakeholders in the UNEP space, but also beyond, on what do they see UNEP today? What was the history of UNEP? What went well? What could go better? What kind of improvements possibilities are there? And what do we want UNEP to be in the future? Therefore, the title, the UNEP We Want. Now, looking at the UNEA special session happening on 3rd and 4th of March, directly after UNEA, there's also a lot of environmental law components that have been introduced to the topics of the special session, which will be basically enriching that developments. Apart from that, there have been quite some consultations happening with major groups and stakeholders, and there are also basically co-authors that have been writing that report based on the consultations and the research that has been done, with also a variety of regional consultations happening on that topic. Now, for UNEA and the UNEA special session on 3rd and 4th of March, the most important question for us, of course, here will be to make sure, first of all, that civil society stakeholders, major groups and stakeholders are represented prominently in the activities, and also the leadership dialogues around that, and to, of course, make sure what is the follow-up of UNEP at 50. So, for example, the close cooperation with the UNEA 6 presidency in order to make sure that this report, the UNEP We Want report, that will also be presented next week in the subcommittee meeting, that this process is actually taking further, and of course, reflecting on the possible political outcome, specifically when it comes to environmental law, and also the connection to the informal consultations that you might be following around environmental law in the 7333 resolution. That was a lot of information and details from. Sorry, I just muted accidentally. So this was this was a lot of background information from my side. And I'm, of course, happy to answer any questions in case there is time. I'm in your hands here.
Thank you very much, Teresa. Always the participation of the youth in all spaces is very, very important. And well, we can definitely see the energy and all the great work being done. Let me give the space now, please, to Dalia Márquez. Hola, Dalia, ¿cómo estás? ¿Estás lista con tu presentación?
Yes.
So please, Dalia, please introduce yourself first, for those who don't know you yet, and please go ahead with your presentation.
Okay, thank you so much, Jadir. Hi, everyone. I am Dalia Márquez from Venezuela. I am part of the accredited NGO Khaled Juventud Unida en Acción. Also, I am part of the Youth Task Force Stockholm Plus 50, and also global focal point of the SDG 12, Sustainable Consumption and Production at the UNEGCY. So Unfortunately, I have some issues with my connectivity, so I am not able to put on my camera or use slides. But in my intervention, I will give you a brief walk through some fundamental aspects of the 73-333 resolution and also some relevant comments. So in this resolution that will be discussed at the UNEA 5.2 also, we have some paragraph like a preamble. The resolution started with the recognition of everyone to live in a healthy and sustainable environment, of course. Also, the reaffirmation of the Unep's role in assisting member states to achieve environmental obligations. The recognition of the different relevant declarations like the Stockholm Declaration and the Action Plan for Human Environmental, the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development and the Agenda 22, the Program for Future Implementation of the Agenda 22, the Johannesburg Declaration on Sustainable Development, and all the other relevant declarations like the Future We Want Declaration and the Rio Plus 20 relevant documents that came like outcomes from this international conference. Of course, in the preamble, this resolution also made the reaffirmation of all the principles of the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, including the inter alia and the principle of common but differentiate responsibilities. This is very important, especially when we talk about the responsibilities of the different states. We have to take into consideration the difference between the development countries and the developed countries and the developing countries. Also in the preamble, this declaration reaffirming the role of the United Nations Environmental Programme as the leading global environmental authority that sets the global environmental agenda and promotes the coherent implementation of the environmental dimension of sustainable development. After this, we start to talk about the operative paragraph. Here, there is a call to commit to enhancing international environmental governance and policies to promote a balanced integration of the environmental, economical, and social dimension of sustainable development, and as well as enhancing coordination between United Nations systems, of course, on the environment and commit to mainstreaming the environmental dimension of sustainable development into sectorial policies and programs at all levels. Also makes a call about to capacity building of both relevant authorities, the public stakeholders, in order to ensure an inclusive, coherent, and integrate approach in the implementation of the 2030 agenda. In the operative paragraph, there is a recognition of the principles of the Rio Declaration on the importance of access to information, access to public participation in decision-making processes, and the access to justice in environmental matters. Also, an invitation to all the member states and members of specialized agencies to disseminate and share evidence-based environmental information and raise public awareness on critical, persistent, and emerging environmental issues. About this, it's very important to highlight that some international agreements or instruments like the Escazú Agreement in Latin America and the Caribbean, by example, are pioneer instruments to ensure environmental justice and the access to information, but also the right to the environmental defenders. So in my perspective, I think that we should ensure the recognition of the environmental defenders in this declaration. In other paragraph, the resolution talks about the commitment to developing and implementing effective international and national environmental legal frameworks, environmental laws, policies, and regulatory frameworks at the national level, as well as capacities across all sectors for the effective implementation of international environmental law. This means not only beautiful agreements or treaties on laws. This means multilateral treaties, but with a framework or guidelines for its implementation. By the moment, we have a lot of declarations, agreements, etc. since 1972, but at the end, we're still waiting for more because we have the agreement, but we don't have the guidelines for the implementation of those agreements. So as civil society, my call is to ensure not only the agreement, we need to ensure the framework and the mechanisms for its implementation. In the Declaration 73.333, there is an invitation to member states and other member specialized agencies to have not yet done so, to consider ratifying relevant multilateral environmental agreements. By example, those countries that at the moment don't have ratified the Escazú Agreement in Latin America should ratify this innovative and pioneer agreement in the region, and to effectively implement them through the incorporation of their environmental agreements and to efficiently implement them. About this, there is a lack of clarity because at the end, not all the countries have a stronger environmental law or rules in the national legal systems. In other cases, countries have amazing frameworks of environmental law, or even they recognize the right to a healthy and clean and sustainable environment in their constitutions, but at the end, don't have stronger institutions to ensure the good implementation of those laws. So at the end, we need not only the laws, we need good institutions and stronger institutions guided by the environmental principles and also ensure the rule of law. That means institutions and effectivity in the implementation of those environmental principles and different laws existence. At the international level, we have a kind of legal vacuum in relation to the legal actions at the international level to sanction serious environmental damage, by example, or ecocide. At the national level, a few countries classify environmental damage as a crime, and many times in the different laws, the criminalization of the environmental damage is not like a big issue, and the sanction is a fine, which is usually insufficient to compensate the damage suffered by different persons and for the ecosystems. This means that in the face of the serious environmental damage in the countries where ecocide or environmental damage is not sanctioned, there is nothing to do. There is no mechanism for the legal defense of the affected people or the restoration of the ecosystems. Some regional courts regulate some aspects related to environmental law, but none refers specifically to ecocide. That is why I take this opportunity to make a call to talk more about the ecocide and the need to include ecocide as an international crime against humanity in the Rome Statute. Of course, I clearly understand that we must to talk about ecocide and define the elements of the ecocide, and it's urgent to propose its sanction in an international organization such as the International Criminal Code. Why? To avoid environmental injustice in the face of the terrible environmental damage. Finally, in the resolution, the states invite to Unep to develop a United Nations periodic environmental performance review mechanism to assess the progress of member states in implementing environmental objectives, with the view to support through recommendations the implementation of the international environmental law and the environmental dimension of the 2030 agenda at the national level, while ensuring complementary with the work of third bodies. About this, obviously, in my perspective, these mechanisms should ensure the participation of civil society in the presentation of comments and inputs about those national reports. I think about something like the high-level political forum, where countries can make like a kind of national reports about the development of the 2030 agenda, but also the different stakeholders and major groups have the right to make comments and give inputs about those national reports. The last one, but not less important, paragraph refers to the active and meaningful engagement of all the relevant stakeholders at all levels in a geographically and gender balanced manner. Also, the facilitation, the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples and tribal peoples in accordance with the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. Local communities, as well as women's, youth, civil society, local governments and authorities, academia, business and financial sectors, and the other relevant stakeholders. About this, and about the participation of the stakeholders, it's necessary to highlight that not all the stakeholders have the same situation and opportunities. Therefore, it's very important to ensure that when we talk about the participation of stakeholders, obviously some groups like children and youth, indigenous communities, NGOs, women, local authorities need more financial support to assist to the different decision-making spaces. Because I, as accredited NGO, as member of an accredited NGO, I see how some major groups, like example, business and industries, have a lot of resources to ensure the participation, but other groups have to do a stronger efforts to assist for those events. So in this last paragraph of the resolution, it's very important to highlight the different barriers that the stakeholders and major groups have to face to participate effectively. By example, when we talk about the language is of some of the groups, especially it's a barrier for the participation from people and major groups coming from developing countries where access to learn and second language is almost impossible. So as civil society, we need to highlight these different aspects because not all the major groups and stakeholders have the same or equal conditions, and we need to take this into consideration. So yeah, to resume, this is a very interesting and important resolution. As you can see, in this resolution, we recognize the environmental principles coming from 1972, 50 years ago. Also, we recognize the right of everyone to live in a clean and healthy environment. This is amazing because the last 49 years, we don't have the specifically recognition of the right to live in an environmental, in a healthy environment. This is amazing. Also, we see some recommendations to implement the principles of the international environmental of the law in the national law framework of the legal system. This is amazing because, by example, in Latin America, only 3 countries have included in their constitutions the rights, the environmental rights. So this is amazing. My observation is that we have an interesting resolution. There is a lack of some relevant aspects that I already highlight in my comments. And my final comment is that I didn't see too much mentions about education. And in my perspective of a lawyer, we need environmental education to ensure the correctly implementation.
Sorry to interrupt you, Dalia,
yeah.
But you have 1 more minute, please.
Okay, yes, I am just closing. So we need environmental education to ensure the correct interpretation of the environmental laws and their implementation, and also to strengthen the different institutions with the responsibility to implement the legal framework on the environmental law. So this is my intervention. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Dalia. Maybe you can share your email address for people to contact you if they have any questions also after the session. There were some problems with the connection, so some parts were not that clear. But yeah, that's why I'm saying that people might want to contact you. Or if you have, I know that you could not share now the presentation, but if you have any information you want to share in the chat, that will be very useful. Thank you, Dalia. So let's move on now to the next presenter, to the next guest, and I would like to welcome a colleague and friend, Ingrid Rostad. Ingrid, are you there?
I'm here.
Hi, Ingrid. Well, good to hear you. Is your presentation ready? You're the host already, so you can share your screen. Do you have a presentation?
Thank you. I don't have a presentation, so you're stuck with my face. But thank you very much for inviting me to this session. It's always great to have these kind of exchanges and the opportunity to talk about what is going on and to connect people to across processes. And I have been given the privilege of talking a little bit about Junea and the road ahead. And I like to think that as any other great meeting in the world, the UN Environmental Assembly cannot just be a moment in time. It has to be an ongoing process. So UNEA 5 will slide into UNEA 6, and that's how we as civil society have to think of it as well. We can never allow it to only be a few days in February every year. We have to think about how can we use the momentum created by Environmental Assembly to further our agendas across processes. And we can never allow what is said, at least if we disagree, we can be silent. But if our member state commits to something at UNEA, we have to remind them of that commitment throughout the year and not let it only be a statement delivered into thin air. And that is part of what I want to talk about now when it comes to civil society engagement. What is becoming clearer and clearer to me is that we need to connect across groups, across major groups, across regions, and across political processes. We need to see how can what is decided in one international meeting affect other international meetings, and how can we as civil society actors, major groups, stakeholders, join forces so that our impact is as strong as possible. And I know that today you have talked a little bit about the agenda for UNEA and also had a briefing on some of the key discussions. We know that it is quite likely that we will have a negotiation mandate for a plastic treaty when we leave Nairobi. That is a major win that we are this close now. Only a few years ago, it didn't feel this close. But that also means that when we leave Nairobi, a new job has just begun for so many who will follow the negotiations. And we need to keep that momentum up. We need to keep all the member states who say something during the UNEA discussions on these resolutions to their promises, to their ambitions, and continue the pressure from within our own states, our own regions, and across, because sometimes outside pressure is more efficient than inside pressure. Also, I know that you talked a little bit about the Stockholm plus 50 process and Unep at 50, and I'd like to just stop for a moment and reflect on how the Stockholm plus 50, it's an international meeting, which is always fun, but it also marks the 50-year anniversary of the Stockholm conference. That was a true milestone in civil society participation in international meetings. It was the first meeting where civil society had an actual seat at the table to the extent it had, and that changed the conditions. And we also now know, and I know this is a very serious challenge that is facing a lot of people across the world, and especially in light of the pandemic, is that the space for civil society is shrinking again. And that is something we need to keep an eye on. We need to take the Stockholm plus 50 event not only as a chance to take stock and demand higher ambitions, but also to remind all the member states, all the leaders, that civil society will not accept not having a seat at the table. They let us in 50 years ago. We do not intend to leave the party. And that is where we're at now. And that is also the kind of spirit I want us to take with us in the discussions around the 50th anniversary of Unep. Major groups and stakeholders have an important position in Unep, and we need to keep that role. And I believe that through these kind of initiatives where we talk among ourselves, where we share experiences, where we give updates, we strengthen that potential for impact. And the way we can work across regions and major groups also makes us more relevant. That is why I also want to mention that at the UNEA we are about to go into, we do have resolutions on the table to discuss nature-based solutions, very big topic, very controversial topic, and also something that is very closely connected to both the climate work and the biodiversity work. And that is why we as civil society also need to look outside of our own networks and have close cooperation with other networks. We need to talk to those who are in the nitty-gritty details of the climate negotiations, those who are in the nitty-gritty details of the Biodiversity Convention, and really take use of that competence and take it into the negotiations at UNEA, so that whatever is decided at UNEA can be a positive and a vitamin injection into our work for a better world, instead of something that makes it more challenging. The same goes for the discussions that we will be having on chemicals and on deep sea mining and environmental governance, not least. this is why we need to be well coordinated. And again, I repeat myself, but it is essential to follow up and to be prepared. We will need to take notes of what signals are being sent as UNEA and take them with us and use them for what they're worth. We will not let someone say all the right words at UNEA and then not follow up at the CBD negotiations only a couple of weeks later, or at the Stockholm +50 event, or later on in the year when the other negotiations continue. That is my encouragement to all of you, is to always think that no event is only the event. UNEA is bigger than a few days in February, and every single process is connected, and we have a very important role to play in connecting those processes and not allowing governments to change their statements unless they're changing it to agree more with us. I think that we are a little bit over time, so I think I'll leave it at that. And then I understand there's a Q&A, so I am also very happy to answer questions if anyone has any.
Thank you very much, Ingrid, for sharing the information, for your message. Very important one, actually. Thank you very much. So now there is the space for question and answer. We're definitely behind the schedule. Maybe Carmen, you want to take over and deal with the question and answer section?
Yes, thank you very much, Kadir. Thank you so much, Ingrid, Dalia, Jane, Teresa, and Simon for expressing and presenting all these issues that are very crucial. Right now we have around 10 minutes. If any of you have any question, you can just raise your hand and or put it in the chat. We're here to answer any question that you feel that it's important. And we are happy to have people from all around the world in this call. We have Pakistan, we have Lebanon, we have England, we have Ecuador, we have Argentina. Thank you everybody for being here and for making this effort really a global effort to engage with civil society. There is a comment by Simone in the chat that Simone says, I agree that we need to collaborate closely with the major groups networks around UNFCCC, the CDB, with issues like nature-based solutions, and the Global Forest Coalition is also a member of the CDB Women's Caucus and the CDB Alliance and the Women and Gender Constituency for UNFCCC, and they've been linking all these issues, especially the ones critical in case of MBCs. So it is indeed quite disturbing that many UNEA NGOs are still supporting MBCs, but the idea is to start talking about these issues in all these different scenarios, especially around MEAs, to have like a common position and to highlight those things that are very well and that are real solutions and that are working, and to be really self-critical about all these things that are becoming part of the process that may not be real solutions. They can help a little probably, but they are not like real solutions. Well, what is the relationship between UNFCCC and UNEA? As I mentioned and I have shown, let me share again my presentation. This is the report that came last week about the first session of UN Environmental Assembly. One of the issues that we have on this report is nature for climate. So it's a way to address climate change as one of the global crises that the planetary crises that we're facing. So it's important to tackle climate change, not only to be sectorial and to be within only one convention, like it's the CDB, or like it's the COPs of the UNFCCC. And that's why we also have climate change, for example, as the goal 13 in the Agenda 2030. And in this report, they speak about some of the important issues around climate change. And right now, the resolutions that we're seeing, the resolution on nature-based solutions, it's linked with climate change. So climate change is not a standalone issue. So it's important not only to just handle it within UNFCCC, but to mainstream it among the different MEAs that we have. I hope that clarifies a little bit and answers your question, Marides. I don't know if there is any other question, because it happens kind of like the same with biodiversity. Biodiversity, it cannot be held on like a separate issue or only an issue that in a standalone issue. That's why it's also linked with Agenda 2030 as in Sustainable Development Goal 15, which is about life on Earth. And I think it's important to start building those connections and those links, and seeing that if we are not seeing these problems as holistic and trying to engage and try to tackle from many different fronts, it's really going to be hard. It's been really hard, actually, to tackle these problems from only one front. That is why we need to start engaging with all these different processes. And if there is no space for a certain issue, we have to, as civil society, open that space. So that is kind of like the idea to start seeing these issues as multi-sectoral issues and mainstream it around the different MEAs. Is there any other question? Well, just to finish, I want to, this webinar has been recorded and is going to be posted on YouTube on the channel of Reacción Climática. And now I would like to invite Gadir to make some closing statements and to close the meeting. And thank you very much for your time and for being in the whole event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carmen. Not really much to say. Just thank again to all of the panelists who shared very important information in all fronts. I think that the coronavirus has, well, should be a moment for us to reflect deeply, to speak up even more if we can in these international spaces, to be more united than ever. I hope the information was useful. Thank you, Carmen, for organizing. I'm glad to see that there are people from all over the world connected, despite the conflicted time schedules. I hope we have all a great start 2022 start to deal with all the issues, the complex issues around the world. Thank you very much and enjoy your mornings, afternoons, evenings. Take care.